Hey guys, this is Guilherme here and welcome to another video. This time we offer another match played at FlyOrDie website, and this was played by white as barros and black as Marcos. White started with d3, d5, bishop to f4, knight c6, d4, h6, e3, knight to f6, bishop to b5 pinning, bishop to d7 on pinning, knight to e2, pawn to e6, knight to d2, bishop to d6 proposing exchange, white exchanged, pawn to c4, pawn to a6, trying to kick the bishop away, but firstly white played pawn takes pawn and then decided to capture the pawn to save the knight, and now bishop to d3, knight to b4, and white here decided not to save the pawn because the only safety square is b1, so this pawn was going to become pretty inactive. So white decided to play knight to b3, proposing to exchange the bishop by the knight. Black accepted, black castled, knight c3, pawn to b5, white castled, pawn to b4, knight to e2, knight to e4. And by the way, just to tell you guys something, this knight to c3 was because of this knight on f6. White, no one would want actually the entrance of the knight here on e4, so c3 was played in intention of busting the advance. However, black advanced the pawn either the way, and the knight had to retreat, giving room for the knight to enter. Anyways, white responded to this entrance of the knight in the center with knight to f4 attacking this pawn, bishop to b5 attacking the queen and the rook, and now queen to c2 and bishop takes rook and rook takes bishop. Knight back to f6 to cover this pawn, knight to d2, rook to c8 attacking the queen, queen to b3 double attacking this pawn. You can see that even though white doesn't have one of the rooks anymore, it's still having quite the action. Pawn to a5, and now knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, queen takes knight, pawn to a4, and you can see that these pawns here on the a file and b file are getting pretty nasty, mainly because the black rook can enter on c2 attacking the knight and attacking the pawn, and this would be quite nasty as well. Here white played knight to e4, rook to c2, invading the pawn structure, queen to b5, trying to say, okay, you can take one pawn of mine, but I'll take one pawn of yours too. Here black played d5, and d5 was a mistake because the d6 pawn was protecting the c5 square, and now white can enter with the knight to c5, getting in action again around those two nasty pawns. Rook took the pawn, queen took the pawn, black thought for a while and tried to play queen to a8, because the idea is exchanging queens, and then this pawn on a1 is falling. White doesn't have much answer to this, so played queen takes queen and rook takes queen, and knight to d3. And knight to d3 was quite the good answer actually, because now it attacks the pawn that is planning to advance, and it's also attacking the rook, so the rook has to move. Here I thought, oh, but black, this is the climax of the match, because I thought, oh, but black can play here, rook takes pawn, and there is a slight checkmate threat on a1. But then I thought, oh, but if rook takes pawn and then knight takes pawn and rook to a1, the knight can take another pawn and loses a rook, but will be 5 pawns up against 3 pawns and versus a knight and a rook. And this was exactly what white did. Black took the pawn, the knight took the pawn on b4, rook to a1, and now the knight took the other pawn on d5. And now rook takes rook with check, queen takes rook. Rook to a1 check, king to e2, f6, king to f3, king to f7, pawn to h4, king to e6 attacking the knight, knight to f4 with check, king to d6, and now here I was like, well, white is with a knight, but it has 2 pawns up, so white is going to win even though. And here white simply just made it a perfect play to win. It was very well thought. It was one of the moves which white took most of the time to play, and played pawn to h5, and this pawn now is en passant, so basically the pawn on g7 can't move. So now black is 2 pawns, is 3 pawns down, and not only 2. Rook to a5 attacking that en passant pawn, but simply pawn to g4 protecting. And I don't know, but I think that in here in the next moves, if white played e4, king to e4, and then pawn to f3, it would be a winning position, because the king would be on the center, unattackable, and the pawn structure would be simply perfect. But this wasn't quite what followed in the game. The game followed with rook to b5, king to g3, rook to a5, knight to d3, rook to a3 attacking the knight, knight to c5 gaining a good position, king to d5, and this king to d5 is planning to invade the c4 square, but the thing is that if the knight remains on the c5, black will not have time to invade it here, the f2 file. It would be protectable only by keeping the knight on c5. So king to f4, rook to a2 attacking his lone pawn, pawn to f3, rook to a3, knight to d7, and now black is about to lose. First he played rook to c3, and now knight to f8, rook to c6, knight to g6, rook to c7. Just notice this position. Here knight to d6. Why rook to c7? Because with knight to d6 the plan is knight to e7 check and the rook's lost. But notice how, because of the two pawn ups that white has, and besides there are two pawn ups, they are all together into the structure. Notice how all black can do is simply defending, and the rook doesn't mean anything. So it was a very perfect game by white. Not perfect, of course, but amazing. Anyways, the rook to c7 to cover this check on e7. Now knight to h4, rook to h7, knight to f5, and here black committed a mistake, which is rook to b7. This knight to f5 had the idea of protecting this pawn on d4 to allow e4 with check. The king could go further into the... actually, sorry. I noticed this in-game, and now I said such a bullshit. Anyways, the king can go to c4 of course, or else knight to d6 check, gaining the forking the rook. So here black played e6, pawn to d5 check, and here black was already lost but committed a mistake. I mean a deadly mistake. Here the king of course can't go to e5 because of the king. The other king can't go to d6 because the knight can't go to e7 because of the knight. And if it goes to d7, black loses the g7 pawn, and it would just slowly be defeated. And if king goes to f7, knight goes to d6 with check, forking the rook, and unfortunately black for some reason decided to protect the pawn on g7 and took the fork, and here was already sufficient to resign, but black continued playing. This is check, knight to d6 is check, so the rook is forked. King to e7 and knight takes rook. King to d7, king to f5, king to c7, knight to c5, king to d6, knight to e6, king to e7, knight takes pawn, king to f7, knight to e6, king to e7, pawn to f4, king to f7, and pawn to d6, and here finally black resigned. I know in the end it was a forking mistake made by black, but I found it amazing how white managed to pull the tables over after losing the rook. And that's why I wanted to share this game with you guys. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you in the next video.